My name is Mark Leonard, and I have written a fictional history book called Let There Be Light. Now, sometimes when I'm talking, I start waving my hands around, and you might notice that I'm missing something on my left hand. Well, I was raised on a farm in Iowa, and when I was 14 years old, I rolled a tractor down a steep road, and the steering wheel took my fingers. But the tractor should have taken my life. This was a wake-up call in my life that God had a purpose for me. But that's a whole other story that we do not have time for this morning. Now, when I was your age, I struggled with what I was being taught on Sunday mornings about creation versus what I heard the rest of the week on how the earth is billions of years old and dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago. And we evolved accidentally from pond scum. And even though I was raised in a Christian family, I was told that I needed to believe by faith. But I was the doubting Thomas. It wasn't until years later that I discovered the scientific facts that prove Genesis. Now, this book, in an entertaining time-traveling format, could prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that Genesis is true. And if Genesis is true, I would bet the rest of the Bible is too. So I'm going to start today by giving you some scientific facts that are going to create more questions than they may answer. And then later in my talk, we may answer some of those questions. And first, we should probably define what is a scientific fact. Now, something that can be observed and studied. The evolution from a species to another species has never been observed. Evolution is only a theory. It is not a science. So here's your first fact for today. 75% of young people raised in a Christian home that attend a secular college will reject their faith by the end of their freshman year of college. Now, why do you think that's the case? I mean, how many of you have seen the movie God's Not Dead? How many of those students were willing to sign a paper that said God is dead? Only one would not. 1 Peter 3:15 says it, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give a reason for your hope. We need to be prepared to defend our faith. So why do you believe in Genesis or the creation when the science world is telling you that it didn't happen? How are you going to defend to somebody out there? Now, how many of you believe in global warming? Now, how many of you think that it isn't true? Well, what if I told you both answers are correct? Now, it is true, deserts around the world are growing. The Sahara Desert is growing at a rate of 30 square miles per year. Science will tell you that less than 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert region was lush and green. Now, that is called a geoclock. We also know that our polar ice caps are melting. Glaciers are retreating at an alarming rate. Back in the 80s, we traveled to Glacier National Park in Montana. The park ranger there informed us that in another 40 years, all the glaciers in the park would be gone. Just a few years ago, my wife and I traveled to Alaska, and we saw many glaciers. Most of them were retreating. They had a picture of one from 1890, and it had retreated over 2 miles. So naturally, we must assume that the world is getting warmer. And if you listen to Al Gore, he would tell you that carbon emissions from our vehicles and coal-burning plants are causing the earth to heat up. Scientists have measured the average temperature of the earth over the past 100 years. How many degrees do you think the earth has warmed during that time? How many do you think it's over 10 degrees? How many do you think it's between 5 and 10 degrees? How many of you are between 1 and 5 degrees? In the last 100 years, the earth has warmed 0.11 degree on average. That is only 1/10 of 1 degree. So why are our deserts growing, our polar ice caps melting, and our glaciers shrinking? How many of you have seen the movie Jurassic World? All the Jurassic movies depict that dinosaurs mysteriously became extinct 65 million years ago, and man didn't evolve until 4 million years ago. So how is it possible that we find human drawings and man-made artifacts depicting dinosaurs on them? On a cave in Arizona, they found pictures of deer, buffalo, and other common animals, along with a T-Rex. Now, how could someone draw a picture of one if they never saw it? One cave drawing depicts a dinosaur with circles on it, so scientists declared that this was a cartoon. Recently, they have unearthed a dinosaur with enough skin on it to determine the patterns actually had circles on it. Now, in China, they have the 12 signs of the zodiac, and each one is represented by an animal. The year of the horse, the monkey, the snake, the rat, the rabbit. And then we have year of the dragon. Now, a dragon is the same as a dinosaur. The word dinosaur was never even invented until 1841. So anytime you see the word dragon in history, it's referring to a dinosaur. Anyway, why would China take 11 real animals for their zodiac and just one mythical? Marco Polo returned from his travels to the Far East, and he declared that the emperor had a dragon keeper and would put his dragons on parade for special occasions. In South America, they've uncovered decorative Inca balls from the temples with dinosaurs on them. But if that isn't enough proof for you, in Glen Rose, Texas, at the bottom of a creek bed, they found fossilized dinosaur tracks. And next to them, they found human footprints. And in one case, the human footprint stepped inside the dinosaur track, which means they had to have walked there at the same time before the creek bed was covered up in some form of a flood, fossilizing the tracks. Now, evolutionists tried to claim that the tracks had been carved there by a prankster, so they chiseled one of the footprints out of the rock bed. Using a cement saw, they cut a cross-section of the footprint, revealing the soft material had been compressed by the weight of a human before it turned to rock. And something odd about these footprints, though, they measure over 18 inches long. But according to science and carbon-14 dating, dinosaurs and man living together isn't possible. As plants and animals live, they ingest radioactive carbon from the sun. When an item dies, it loses half of its radiocarbon every 5,600 years. Since fossilized dinosaur remains had very little radiocarbon, means they had lived millions of years ago. Unless they lived at a time on Earth when they did not absorb radioactive carbon. We're going to talk more about that later. So are there still dinosaurs alive today? Sure. On the islands of Indonesia are the Komodo dragons. They are large lizards growing up to 10 feet long and can weigh as much as 200 pounds. They are carnivorous and live about 35 years in the wild. Now, I'm sure you're thinking for something to qualify as a dinosaur, it would have to be 100 feet long and weigh 10 tons. We will be discussing later how man lived over 900 years before the flood due to the conditions on the earth. Well, if man lived a lot longer before the flood, why wouldn't animals? And keep in mind, mammals quit growing once they reach maturity. Reptiles never quit growing their entire life. So if a Komodo dragon was 10 feet long and weighed 200 pounds after 35 years, how big do you think it would be after 500 years? There are numerous stories through history of people encountering dragons or dinosaurs. St. George of England slew a dragon in 275 AD. The Vikings were known as the first civilization to sail the oceans. They reported stories of great sea monsters rising up out of the oceans and attacking their ships. The Vikings were so convinced that these creatures were out there, they would carve the head of one of the beasts on the front of their ship, hoping that when the monster rose up out of the water, it would be frightened by the head of another monster. And I don't think the Vikings would take the time to hand carve the head of a serpent on the front of their ship if it really didn't exist. So are there dinosaurs talked about in the Bible? Again, they weren't called dinosaurs. If you look in Job 40:15, God tells Job to behold Behemoth, which means he could physically look at him. Behold Behemoth, which I made along with you. He feeds on grass like an ox. What strength he has in his loins. What power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways like a cedar. The muscles in his thighs are strong. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like rods of iron. He ranks first among the works of God, which means he probably was the largest of God's creation. Here in the Bible, after the flood, we have a perfect description of a brontosaurus-type creature. Now, some Bibles may footnote a hippo or an alligator. Hippos do not have a tail like a cedar tree, and alligators do not eat grass like an ox. When the Bible talks of the lions, the bears, and the beasts of the field, what do you think those beasts of the field were? And so where are those beasts today? Now, how many of you have seen the movie Ice Age? Who was the main character? Yes, it was Manny the Mammoth. And what part of the world did he live in? Any pictures that you see of mammoths, it looks like a barren, icy tundra. Why is that? A full-grown mammoth would eat almost 100 pounds of vegetation a day. The reason that they depict the mammoths living in the icy condition is because they have found over 100,000 mammoths frozen in the permafrost in the Arctic. So, science assumes that they must have thrived in these icy conditions. In reality, they have done autopsies on the beasts and found undigested tropical plants in their stomachs. And in one case, they even found a mammoth with tropical plants still in its mouth when it was frozen. Now, science will tell you that our ice age happened gradually with the earth cooling 1 degree a year for hundreds of years, as the glaciers grew as far south as central Iowa. Now, let me tell you something odd about the Ice Age. Even though the ice flowed as far south as Iowa in North America, on the Europe side of the world, it barely touched Siberia. Now, Siberia today is one of the coldest regions of the world. Why wouldn't the ice have gone there? If you look at a map from the top side of the world, you will discover the Ice Age centered around magnetic North Pole. Not the North Pole that the Earth rotates on today. Well, as the temperature gradually got colder, these beasts would have followed where their food was most abundant, which would have been to the south. But for some unknown reason, these mammoths could not move out of the way of this glacier ice flow in time. Or maybe they got stuck in the mud, or they walked out on an ice-covered lake and fell through while chewing their tropical plants. Now, the autopsies of these animals found that they were frozen so quickly that the digestive juices in their stomach did not have time to break down what it had eaten in the last few hours. Scientists tell us that these mammoths had to be frozen at 300 degrees below zero. There is no place on Earth today where it is that cold. If you go to the Smithsonian Institute in New York, you will find on display a mammoth that was frozen standing up. He never even had time to fall over. And numerous other animals have been quick frozen in the Arctic, and today that we would not find in cold regions of the world. And speaking of our polar caps, did you know that the ice over Antarctica is 17,000 feet thick? That is over 3 miles deep. 1 mile the ice is below sea level. And below that ice is frozen trees, grass, and flowers. The South Pole has a lot more ice than the North Pole does. Science will tell you that millions of years of blizzards created the ice. Our polar regions are the most arid sections of the world. Our storm fronts flow around the Earth and not over the poles. And the polar ice is salt freeze. It is not frozen ocean water. Now, you've probably been taught by now that there is a layer of ozone surrounding our atmosphere. It helps keep our oxygen and carbon dioxide in here and also blocks out the damaging radiation of the sun. Well, above Antarctica is a huge hole in our ozone layer. There was a small hole above the North Pole, they feel, at one time, but science says it looks like it's healing itself. Now, again, if you talk to Al Gore, he would tell you that because of carbon emissions from our vehicles and factories, they are eating away at our ozone layer. Well, you tell me this. If carbon emissions are the source of our problem, would there be more damage above the US, Great Britain, Europe, Russia, and China, or above Argentina, South Africa, and Australia? So how on earth could all of this happen? Now, trilobites were little marine creatures with exoskeletons that supposedly thrived 500 million years ago. They became extinct in some global catastrophe 250 million years ago. Now, here's a picture of one that got killed, stepped on, by something wearing sandals. Doesn't it look like man and trilobites lived at the same time? Now, archaeologists have dug down through the different layers of sediment in our fossil record, naming them in accordance with what they find. For example, in the Jurassic layer, we would find dinosaurs. They have determined that there are 12 different layers of sediment. There is only one place in the world where they have found all 12 layers. Your science textbook. There is no place on earth where they can find all of them. 85% of the earth only has 3 of the layers. But yet we find thousands of examples of mammals down in the fishes or where they possibly could not have existed. They are millions of years out of place. But we don't hear about it because they have no explanation how they would have gotten there. Now here's a picture of 500 petrified giant oysters on top of the Andes Mountains in Peru. Any guesses how they were fossilized on top of a mountain and why they were so huge? Most of our gas and oil was formed from dinosaur grease. That is why the Sinclair station has their symbol as a brontosaurus. Science will tell you that hundreds of dinosaurs had to die at the same time, in the same place, and be covered up with a massive amount of sediment. The grease from these animals pooled together and percolated while the sediment around it solidified into rock. When drillers strike oil pockets today, we have gushers. Science will tell you that those pockets will stay pressurized for 20,000 years until the oil would seep into the rock, relieving the pressure around it. Now, those same scientists will tell you that dinosaurs died off 65 million years ago. And these pressurized pockets will remain pressurized for 20,000 years. Something is wrong with one of those numbers. The Earth's magnetic field has decreased 6% in the last 150 years. Working backwards, this is another geoclock, the Earth could not have survived hundreds of thousands of years ago because the magnetic field would have been too strong. NASA has discovered the moon is moving away from the Earth at the rate of 2 inches per year. Now that doesn't sound like much. The current science theories say the Earth and the moon were a product of the Big Bang 4 billion years ago. And the moon is moving away from the Earth at a rate of 2 inches per year. Anyone want to guess where the moon should be right now? So now scientists are trying to say, claiming maybe the moon was only 14,000 miles from the Earth when it was formed. Even you and I know the gravitation of the Earth would have pulled the moon in if it was that close to the Earth. Science has a lot of problems with the Big Bang Theory, but the biggest is the creation of time, space, and matter, otherwise known as cosmic evolution. The first thing that had to happen scientifically is that time, space, and matter all had to come into being at the same time. I mean, if you had matter and time, but no space, where would you put it? If you had matter and space, but no time, when would it be? And if you had time and space, but no matter, where would the matter come from? How in the world would all 3 of those things come into existence accidentally, or just by chance, all at the same moment? So the other option is that time, space, and matter are eternal. They have always been in existence. Well, that creates another problem for science and the law of thermodynamics. Energy will use itself up. You know, if I throw a ball, eventually it's going to fall to the ground because it runs out of energy. Science predicts that the sun will burn itself up in 50 million years. It is not renewing itself. So the sun, like the rest of the stars in the universe, will run out of energy. From that observation, science has determined that they all had to have a beginning. Is it not a coincidence that time, space, and matter are mentioned in the very first verse of the Bible? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, which is time, God created the heavens, which is space, and the earth, which is matter. All three came into being at the same time, not accidentally done, but choreographed by a great architect. Now, if you haven't noticed, God likes the number 3. He likes to work in trinities. You know, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, the trinity of creation is time, space, and matter. And each of those have their own trinity. The trinity of time is past, present, and future. The trinity of space is length, width, and height. And the trinity of matter is it's either a solid, liquid, or gas. I think God had a lot of fun while He was making His creation. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Anyone want to guess how many heavens there are? Well, the Bible talks about 3 of them. Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 12:2 being taken up to the third heaven, which is the throne of God. So the other 2 heavens in the Bible that are mentioned are the birds fly in the heaven above. This would be our atmosphere. And the sun, the moon, the stars were placed in the heaven above. And that is going to be outer space, which is heaven number 2. Now the earth was formless and void. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Was there any land? No. We have a huge ball of water. Day 1, God said, "Let there be light." And I think that would be a great title for a book. Was there any sun? No. We assume that the light came from heaven number 3. And there was evening and a morning, the first day, which means the light was directional. Also note that the day begins in the evening. That is why the Jewish days begin at sundown. It is also an indication that it's a 24-hour day because there was an evening and a morning in the day. But please take very special note of day 2. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. It was so, and God called the expanse what? Sky. Where did God put part of the water on the earth? I mean, here's the earth, here's the sky, and part of the water went up, creating a sphere of water surrounding the sky. He did not change some water to vapor and put clouds in the sky. He put water above the sky, which is heaven number 1. And is it up there now? When our space shuttles go into outer space, do they go through a layer of water? No. I wonder where it went. People have been speculating for years where the water came from for the flood. It has been written down in front of us all of this time. Now, is there any other place in the Bible where it talks about this water canopy? The psalmist wrote in 148 verse 4, "Praise Him, ye highest heavens, and ye waters above the skies." Even David knew what God had done. Now, science will tell you at the Earth's current orbit and pitch to the sun that it would be impossible to maintain a water belt around the Earth. Current status? That may be true. But what was our status prior to the flood? The early documents of man indicate that there were only 10 months of 30 days in a month in a calendar year. I want you to notice for a moment the last 4 months of our calendar. September, October, November, and December. Now for your Latin or Spanish students out there, I want you to count 7, 8, 9, and 10. Sept, Oct, Nova, Deca. What numbered months are those today? 9, 10, 11, and 12. The months January and February were added to the calendar by Roman Emperor Numa Pompilius in 713 BC. I propose to you that the Earth's calendar year prior to the flood was 10 months, totaling 300 days. And if you take the Earth's closest rotation to the sun and put that in a circular orbit, That is what you get. And because of this perfect rotation around the sun, the earth could have sustained a water belt as talked about on day 2 of creation. And this also takes care of the problem in the flood story when it jumps from the 10th month to the 1st month. And what would this sphere of water do to the earth's environment? First of all, this water belt would have blocked out the damaging rays emitted by the sun. Would you believe that if we were not exposed to ultraviolet and infrared rays that we could live to be 1,000 years old? Isn't it coincidental that prior to the flood, the majority of the people lived 900 to 1,000 years? And then, as soon as the flood came, the lifespans dropped off significantly. Look at the age charts. Notice they didn't drop off all at once. Hereditary traits are acquired and passed on to the next generation. That is why Shem, one of Noah's sons, lived longer than 8 generations past him. Some people have proposed that prior to the flood, man counted the lunar cycles as years instead of solar cycles. Again, if you look at the age charts, you will see that Enoch became the father of Methuselah at the age of 65. If months were years, he'd only been 6 years old when he had a son. And just a side note about Enoch and Methuselah, Enoch was a godly man and he's walking and talking with God, and then he was no more. God may have helped him with the naming of his son. Methuselah's name means, when he dies, it shall come. Methuselah died at the age of 969 years, the year of the flood, but not in the flood. According to the Quran, he died. Noah and his family went in the ark for 7 days of mourning, and then the flood came. And something else this belt of water would do is concentrate the oxygen and carbon dioxide. It is called hyperbolic oxygen. Physicians have constructed hyperbolic chambers for people who are sick. The healing process in some cases doubles. Many professional football teams are using them. Now, do we have any proof the oxygen was concentrated like that before the flood? Now, most of you have seen the Jurassic Park movie. And where did they get their DNA samples to repopulate the dinosaurs? From mosquitoes trapped in prehistoric amber. Pre-flood amber has been discovered, and inside they have found bubbles of air. Now, today, we breathe air that is comprised of 21% oxygen. The oxygen in pre-flood amber is 34%. All the more reason why people were healthier and lived longer pre-flood. Scientists have also determined that most dinosaurs could not survive now because their nostrils were too small to get enough oxygen into their lungs. With hyperbolic conditions, they were just fine. And using hyperbolic carbon dioxide, a man grew a cherry tomato plant that's over 16 feet tall. The cherry tomatoes are the size of baseballs, and to date have produced over 15,000 tomatoes from one plant. And when God finished with his creation, he said, it was very good. Very good to God, I think, is perfect. The earth prior to the flood was in a perfect circular orbit around the sun with only a 300-day year. The circular orbit would have allowed a water belt to physically sustain where our ozone layer is today. Remember, science said we could not sustain a water belt due to our oblong orbit. Now, again, they are judging the earth by today's standards. Scientifically, if the earth was in a perfect orbit around the sun rotating on its magnetic axis, it would be physically possible to sustain the water canopy. This belt of water would have created the infamous greenhouse effect we've all heard about. The global temperature would have remained constant year-round, ranging from 75 degrees at the equator to 65 degrees at the poles. Humidity levels would have been tremendous, with the dew point just a few degrees lower than the temperature. Remember when God went walking in the garden in the cool of the day in Genesis 3:8? And it talks about in Genesis 2 how a mist rose up and watered the ground. Enormous amounts of dew would have collected every night. In these conditions, plants would have flourished. There would have been very little wind to dry out the plants, and they would not have the storm systems that we have today, similar to those plants being grown in a greenhouse. That's why the name greenhouse effect. But all these plants would have breathed in too much carbon dioxide, constantly filling the air with oxygen. God needed some balance, and he took care of the problem on day 6 of creation when he made all the beasts of the field. Some of these beasts required massive amounts of vegetation, hundreds of pounds every day, and these beasts were the dinosaurs. Now, like I said, you never see the word dinosaur in the Bible, and that's where they are called dragons. It's the same reason you don't see the word skyscraper in them when they're talking about the Tower of Babel. So, like I said, in the Bible they were called dragons. The word dragon is used 35 times. And according to the Catholic Bible, the prophet Daniel killed a dragon, except he killed it scientifically. In chapter 14, verse 26 of the Catholic Bible, it says, "Then Daniel took pitch, fat, and hair. He boiled them together. He made balls and fed them to the dragon, and his stomach burst." Daniel made something the dinosaur would like to eat, but he couldn't digest it. So he developed major constipation. So how could man possibly exist with these ferocious animals at the same time? Well, number one, man would not try to live in the middle of these animals' feeding grounds. If man wanted to live in a certain area, he simply cut down the vegetation in that area, and the dinosaurs would move on to better eating grounds. But number two may be very more important. Let's look at Genesis 1:29. "Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food." Before the flood, man was a vegetarian. Numerous fossils of plants very rich in protein have been found that became extinct after the flood. Man was not a threat to the animals since he did not hunt them for food. Now, look at the very next verse. "And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." Would you believe at the time of creation all animals were vegetarians also? So man wasn't a threat to the animals, and the animals weren't a threat to man. But then flip over to Genesis 9:2. This is right after the flood. Noah gets off the ark, and he says, "The fear and dread of you will fall upon the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea." Here it is, right after the flood, and God is telling Noah that now the animals are going to fear man. What assumption does that give you for prior to the flood? And look at what happens in the very next verse. "Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you green plants, I now give you everything." God in his wisdom knew that man would no longer be able to sustain himself on vegetation. With the changing climates and severe conditions, it would take a higher base of protein for man to survive. So how does science keep coming up with the supposed fact that dinosaurs are so much older than man? Well, first of all, on an evolutionary standpoint, reptiles evolved into birds, which evolved into bats, which are mammals, and they evolved into man, so that took a long time. And one of the tools that they use is carbon-14 dating. Let's take a quick look at how carbon-14 dating works. As an animal lives, it takes in radioactive carbon from the plants they eat. The plants get their radioactive carbon from the sun. Today, science has registered how much radiocarbon an animal takes in during its lifetime by measuring carbon-12. Once an item dies, it starts losing the radioactive carbon. It will lose half of its radiocarbon every 5,600 years. And then the next 5,600 years, it loses half again, and so on. Naturally, scientists have not been able to physically watch an item for 5,600 years to see what happens, so this falls more into the theory range. So archaeologists dig up this old bone and measure how much radiocarbon it has left in it, and then calculating forward to see how much radiocarbon it should have had when it's alive to determine how old it is. And the dinosaurs always come up to be millions of years old. Can you see anything wrong with this procedure? What are they basing their assumptions on to determine how much radiocarbon would be in a live dinosaur? They are taking today's conditions and the amount of radiocarbon it would be taking in today. And what were the conditions like before the flood, when the dinosaurs roamed the earth? This is where the light bulb is supposed to start coming on. Assuming that you have a light bulb. Remember the water belt and what that did to the radioactive particles being emitted by the sun. They were practically all blocked out. So how much radiocarbon would the dinosaurs have ingested? Hardly none. And then half of whatever was there has dissipated away. And that is why they come up to be millions of years old. All of the aging techniques that are based off of radioactivity are off because they're trying to measure conditions in the past by today's standards. Today our scientists are using the wrong equation to measure carbon-14 for anything that lived prior to the flood. So, if dinosaurs did exist with man prior to the flood, were dinosaurs on the ark? What does the scripture say? Genesis 7:2. Take 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate. Was a dinosaur a kind of animal? I believe it was. Well, how would those huge animals fit on the ark? Remember, dinosaurs are reptiles, and reptiles are self-sufficient soon after being hatched. Dinosaurs the size of cows could have easily sustained themselves on the ark without taking up too much room. And also keep in mind, since reptiles never quit growing their entire life, and with the extended ages before the flood, the reptiles would have the opportunity to grow to be enormous. So even if dinosaurs were living today, they may only grow to be about the size of elephants before dying of the same radiation that you and I do. Remember the Komodo dragons in Indonesia we talked about? If they lived in pre-flood environment for 500 years, you can imagine how huge it would have been. I mean, they would have looked like a dinosaur. What was God's promise given to Noah at the end of the flood? That he would never destroy the world again with water. And what did he show to verify this promise? A rainbow. And what makes a rainbow? Ultraviolet rays shining through water droplets. That is why it is not physically possible to have rainbows before the flood, because the ultraviolet rays could not penetrate the water canopy. Back to our days of creation. Day 3, let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear. Let the land produce grass and trees. Did God raise up mountains here? No. He took part of the water away in day 2. Naturally, the remaining water would float to the lowest spot. Remember, in the beginning, the earth was formless. We had no monster peaks, no grand canyons, just rolling hills. So what would happen 1,500 years later if God decided to allow all that water to rain back on the earth? It should completely cover it all back up again, right? So if the water is all gathered in one place, where would all the land be? Is all the water on the earth in one place now? Is it possible that we had a supercontinent prior to the flood, just like science tells us? It's called Pangaea. Have you ever looked at a map of the world and see how the east coast of North and South America matches up with Europe and Africa? If that is the case, when did the land divide? Well, believe it or not, the Bible tells us exactly when it divided. Look at Genesis 10:25. 2 sons were born to Eber. One of them was named Peleg because in his time the earth was divided. This would have been very convenient soon after the Tower of Babel. The people gathered together in their own language groups, went to different areas of the landmass, and then the land divided. The people that ended up in North and South America didn't have to find a route over the North Pole to get here. Day 4. God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars to be placed in the heaven above. Again, that's heaven number 2. Some people have argued that the stars are so far away that light would not have reached the earth by now. If God has the power to create the stars, don't you think he has the power to create their light beam to the earth also? Some people have proposed that there were thousands of years between the days of creation. If grass and trees were created on day 3, how long would they have survived until the sun was created on day 4? Day number 5, let the waters teem with living creatures. Let the birds fly in the heaven above. Again, that's heaven number 1. Day 6, let the land produce living creatures according to the kinds. livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals. Man did not have to tame his own livestock. God created livestock to be under man's care. Evolution will tell us that the animals were here millions of years before man. Can anyone tell me how a sheep would survive in the wild? If a wolf attacks, their line of defense is to crouch down and bleat. It has taken man protecting them all these years for them to survive. And is it any wonder that we are compared to sheep in the Bible? Without Christ, our good shepherd, we don't stand a chance either. And God said, let us make man in our image to rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air and the animals on the land. And when God had finished creating everything on day 7, he rested. Not because God needed the rest, but because he was setting an example for us that we need to rest one day a week and keep it holy. So following creation, we have an earth in a perfect orbit around the sun, rotating on its magnetic axis 300 days a year. The world is surrounded by a water canopy, keeping the entire planet tropical from pole to equator. Humidity levels are tremendous, with hyperbolic oxygen and carbon dioxide filling the air. The world is covered in vegetation, with millions of dinosaurs keeping the plants and oxygen levels in check. The ocean levels are only a fraction of what they are today, with a supercontinent landmass. And man lived to be hundreds of years old. Then something happened to change all this. Now, naturally, the Bible talks about the flood occurring about 1,500 years following creation, but scientifically, why did it happen? What made the water belt come down? How did thousands of animals get quick frozen in ice? How did vegetation get mowed down and covered up with sediment to make our coal deposits? Why would glacier ice come as far south as Iowa but barely touch Siberia on the other side of the world? Why did our planet switch from a 300-day year to a 365? How could mammoths get frozen standing up while chewing tropical plants? And why is our planet now rotating on a different axis than our magnetic one? And how does the Bible say the flood occurred? Well, if you look at Genesis 7:11, on that day the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. The springs of the great deep burst forth. What does that mean? Water shooting out of the ground? The great deep normally refers to our oceans. Could it be the oceans coming out of their beds and spilling over dry ground? Either way, please note that the water came out of the ground before the floodgates of heaven opened. And I'll give you one free fact that isn't in my book. Many people will argue against the possibility of Noah being able to survive in the ark for over a year. Number one, because the ark would break apart in the violent waves, and number two, because he could not store enough fresh water for all the animals in his family. Our oceans today are 3.6% salt and getting saltier. Working backwards, this is another geoclock. We had freshwater oceans less than 5,000 years ago. To stabilize the ship that was 1.5 football fields long, they installed a moon pool, or a baffle, in the middle of the ship. As the ship went up and down over the waves, it would work like a piston, pumping fresh air into the vessel. They could easily draw fresh water up from the non-salty waters, and when they needed to clean out the animal pens, they had a place to dispose of it. Naturally, after they got their drinking water out. What occurred when the floodgates did open? Most people think massive clouds formed and it rained 40 days and 40 nights. Scientifically, all of our clouds surrounding the earth could only rain worldwide for 2 days. My guess is, the day of the flood, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. But as we mentioned earlier, the scripture tells us exactly where the water came from. The question is, what ruptured the water belt, sending it back raining to the earth for 40 days and 40 nights? And that's a whole nother story that we don't have time for today. But you will find the answers in my book, Let There Be Light. But the main question for you today is, do you believe that accidentally time, space, and matter formed out of nothing? And from that matter, life was able to accidentally begin. And that life form split into both plants and animals, evolving into everything we see around us today. Or do you believe there is a God that is capable of making everything just the way we see it? And if you answer the latter to those two, then you have another question to answer. What are you going to do with the fact that you know there is a God? Just because you believe there is a God doesn't put you on his side. The demons in hell believe there's a God and shudder. You have to make a conscientious decision whether to follow him or to just keep doing the things that you want to do. Are you going to be one of those 75% of the kids who were raised in a Christian home and you lose your faith by the time you're 20 years old? You know, I believe creation is real. I believe the flood happened. I also believe the rest of the Bible is true. The question is, do you really believe it?